If you were to go and ask somebody you knew to name a handful of animals off the top of their head, you'll probably get your normal answers like dog, cat, elephant, bear, and so on and so on. But I'd reckon that not too deep into that list you'll arrive at gorillas, which historically is actually quite strange, as they are a relatively recent addition to any sort of mass awareness. There are still clues, though, left throughout history, and depending on which cultural lenses you examine the evidence by, in application to different time periods, I believe it is very possible to argue that in certain moments and eras, gorillas attained a cryptid-like status, strictly in regards to reputation. For now, try to imagine gorillas relative to like Rousseau or a 9th century Bantu farmer, as being similar to how, like, Bigfoot is to you and me nowadays. Not actually a perfect example in my opinion, but I think you get what I'm going for when I say that. My favorite example to show just how recent popular knowledge of them is comes from one of the many derogatory nicknames Abraham Lincoln would pick up during his political career, being, well, a gorilla. This correlation between Lincoln and gorillas can be documented back to around 1860, plus or minus like a year. It might go back even further to like the mid 1850s with a beef he had with Edwin Stanton. I haven't found evidence to support that, but anyway, what makes all of that so interesting to me is that at that point in time, gorillas had only been officially discovered for like a decade, as it was only in the year 1847 that the American missionary Thomas Savage came back from the west coast of Africa with an unidentified ape skeleton. Soon after, he would publish a description of it alongside Jeffries Wyman, one of America's leading anatomists, calling it a gorilla. We'll get into how that name came about a little bit later. This announcement of a new discovery was the recipient of massive popularity, especially with a similar find reaching Europe just weeks later. So pretty quickly, people definitively knew about this strikingly large ape secluded in the forests of Africa, but any exact idea of what it actually was still obscured and up for speculation. There were many instances of more bones and also hides being retrieved from Africa, which led some to attempt to depict their appearance or extrapolate some of their behaviors. It led to some mixed results. And it wasn't until the end of the 1850s that Paul du Chaillu, an explorer of Central Africa, would return from the continent and back to the Western world with more gorilla artifacts, but more importantly than that, by his experiences, he was able to give what was considered the first eyewitness account of a living gorilla by somebody that was actually aware of them already. He would publish a book detailing all of that in mid-1861, reaching massive popularity and basically confirming the existence of gorillas to the wider world. So, now that I've given you the introductory info dump, going back to the Lincoln example, yes, all of this connects. This timeline kind of implies that Lincoln's detractors genuinely couldn't have actually known what gorillas looked like. They were straight up just going, yeah man, you know that animal that literally nobody knows the actual appearance of? Yeah, you kinda look like that. Which, to preface this with my sincerest apologies to my former president, they were kinda onto something, to be honest. Think about it. He was tall, well built, both compliments, by the way. He had a uniquely liney face, I guess. He was very hairy, like a gorilla. I wouldn't say he actually looks like a gorilla, but he looks disproportionately more like a gorilla compared to the average person, if that makes sense. But anyway, to segue myself towards some actually relevant information, by the phrase literally nobody, I actually mean a surprising amount of people. If it was actually literally nobody, they wouldn't have a candidacy to be former cryptids, as throughout this video we'll be covering the stories of explorers across 2.5 millennia, who knows how many indigenous African tribes spanning even longer, and considering the unseriousness of the topic of this video, some weirdly deep probing of mine into the human consciousness. You'll know what I mean later by that. We're gonna go to some odd places. Stick with me. I'll try to make it interesting. To start, let's talk about how we're gonna break things down during this video. Since, well, if you look at the video length, we have a lot of data to go through before we get around to answering the actual premise. of if, at any point, gorillas were something that we would recognize as kind of like a cryptid. The reason my tone of voice sounds a little unsure there is because the definitions here aren't exactly that clear, but I'm going to try my best. Let's start by just considering the basic Merriam-Webster definition, an animal that has been claimed to exist but not proven to exist. The closer any animal gets to fulfilling those criteria, the more willing I'd be to call it a cryptid. All we're doing in this case is just applying it retroactively, but because we're looking at animals that were eventually discovered, assuming that people were disputing their existence one way or the other, we can actually look at what they were imagining in their heads and seeing how that would line up with the eventual reality that we're familiar with, which will make things a little tricky. Just as a starting point, let's consider the definition Merriam-Webster gives us. First is the object of the sentence, the animal, in this case, our gorilla, which is being claimed to exist despite the lack of substantial evidence. And second is the subject, the collective of people who accurately concocted the idea of gorillas in their head and publicly believed it despite not having that substantial evidence. It may sound, like I said, literally nothing there, but trust me, things get so complicated and technical later on that and everything that comes after this is kinda necessary. But going back to that first point, what I draw out from all of that is that when we observe or hypothesize about how certain individuals or cultures responded to authentic guerrilla narratives, how closely they described what we would now recognize as gorillas, I think determines how accurately the term cryptid would apply to that circumstance. If we're going to try to make the claim that gorillas were cryptids, it doesn't matter how much they were talking about stories that featured them, if they didn't imagine anything like them in response. In evaluating how accurate it would be to call a previously unknown animal a cryptid, I'd call this the definitional factor, for which I've identified two subcomponents. First is the description, which I don't really need to explain too much. It's a mix of behavioral and cosmetic traits. You're looking for the basic identifiers like large, tall, strong, dark-haired, having a human-like anatomy, intelligence, a social structure, and residence among the forests of Central Africa. Of course, a certain level of vagueness or inaccuracy kinda has to be tolerated if you want to call gorillas cryptids. Every account isn't gonna flesh things out perfectly, or they're just gonna get stuff wrong. You're gonna have some stuff that's like, my friend told me that over in the Congo there's these big old hairy men, and that they can grow even bigger and stronger than people, and you'll have to decide if that's enough for you. And you're also going to have stuff that might just err in some way. Maybe their hair color is mixed up, or there's some behavioral traits attributed to them that we nowadays wouldn't recognize as correct. And you may have to decide if that's too inaccurate for you. But of course, the closer any person of interest gets to imagining what you would recognize as a gorilla, the better. The second subcomponent of our definitional factor is its distinction, as in how separated is any individual's concept of what we know to be gorillas, assuming that it was at least somewhat accurate, from other understood concepts that it could be confused with. I suppose you could just lump this in as just another part of the definition, but it came up so much and its implications can be so big in some cases that I thought it ought to be observed separately. To give a quick hypothetical, let's say somebody were to give a picture-perfect description. They go so far beyond what I ever saw, they're talking about stuff like sagittal crests, pregnancy durations, lifespans, stuff that looks lifted straight from a modern encyclopedia. But right at the end they go, yeah, this is actually a regional variant of those apes we find out in the East Indies. Whole descriptions can be kinda thrown off pretty easily. What if these are just a kinda smaller version of those apes we already saw? What if these are just full-grown versions of those? What if these are actually just weird forest people? Will a valid description necessarily be thrown off by its communicator guiding the recipient to order it that wrongly in the world? Yeah, to some degree, but I do think it's a little more nuanced than that. One of the bigger concerns is actually someone seeing that misapplication and then taking what they know of the creature that it was confused with and applying its trace to what could have been a pretty unblemished imagination of a gorilla, What I'm imagining in my head is someone hearing a gorilla description, it becomes too linked with the image of an orangutan that they're already familiar with their head, and at that point they're just imagining a darker colored orangutan, which if something like that were to repeat too many times, it would make me less willing to say that gorillas were at one point cryptids. In general, regarding description and distinction, the two dangers we'll need to keep an eye out for is obfuscation and miscorrelation. Alright, so when I say that for a previously undiscovered species to have been a cryptid, attempts to define it must have been made in its time before being confirmed, and for those proposed definitions which can be understood as its details and the distinctions applied to that, and the more accurate those subcomponents were in regard to what it was attempting to describe, the more proper it would be to call that species a former cryptid upon discovery. Do you understand what I mean? I hope so, because you remember that second point I said a bit ago? The subject, the collective of people who accurately concocted the idea of gorillas in their mind, and publicly believed it despite not having the substantial evidence? Yep. We have to draw out a similar amount of stuff from that point as well. The essential thing to understand here is that it's not what people or cultures were imagining in their heads in response to authentic gorilla narratives, but who exactly was interested, how interested were they. That'll have a bearing on how much of a cryptid something is. Just how many people want to know the unknown, and how badly. In evaluating how accurate it would be to call a previously unknown animal a cryptid, I'd call this the relevance factor, which also has two subcomponents. First is the popularity. How many people were aware of the tales of big, strong, dark-haired African apes that we in the modern age can recognize as coming from gorillas, or more broadly, the stories of great apes too, as well as the conversations that surrounded them. And second is the engagement. How interested were these individuals in understanding all of that? What was it about these stories that motivated that, and how intense was that curiosity? And I don't believe I need to explain why popularity and engagement among a population correlates to relevance. Rather, there was a presupposition there that I kind of skipped over, and I'm curious if any of you noticed it. Why does relevance or irrelevance make me more or less willing to say that an undiscovered animal was a cryptid? First off, there are actually just some definitions that I've read online that actually do make disputation or rejection from accredited zoological authorities a requirement for cryptid status. I don't really lean one way or the other on that, but I do think if you look into this thread, there's a bit of a profundity, or at least as close as you can get to that, considering the silliness of this topic, I guess, when approaching this question of required relevance. Let's take a hypothetical. I see some weird, scaly person with a tail or something, and maybe he's got like horns too, and he like runs into the sewers. I go and tell my brother, dude, you won't believe what I saw, blah 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 blah. And he doesn't believe me. Is that animal now a cryptid? Because there's me who's claiming it to exist, but as far as my brother is concerned, it's unconfirmed. Our new sewer dweller is just as much of a cryptid at that point as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. And that feels wrong. My immediate response to this would just be that it's more proper to say that there are some really popular cryptids like the Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, and some more niche cryptids like my proposed sewer dweller. But in the end, they are all equally cryptids. And sure enough, if you go on YouTube and search anything similar to the title of this video, you'll find all sorts of videos saying that X animal was discovered at some point but spent Y years until it was officially discovered, and thus was a cryptid for that period of time. And plainly, they are right. I don't want to appear as if I'm trying to subvert what they're doing. I find that kind of stuff cool and neat, and I like it. Those individuals are working properly in respect to some definitions of the word, but for my purposes, I've found that kind of criteria wanting. Here, I'll lean on the nature of all things mysterious, which is that for any given mystery, if it becomes relevant and people in mass are seeking to uncover the truth about it, and yet it remains a mystery, the more inherently mysterious that mystery is. In other words, while the mystery itself may maintain the same components, how it is viewed and by what population of people may enable it to become even more of a mystery. For cryptids, that mysterious nature or hiddenness is an inseparable part of what a cryptid is. Therefore, the more mysterious a cryptid is, the more it realizes the end of what it could maximally be, and thus the more mysterious a cryptid is, which is derived from relevance applied to an already mysterious thing, the more willing I am to call that thing a cryptid, assuming it already meets the other qualifications. I think the reason I'm so, hung up on this part is because I'm doing this from a historical lens and not from the modern lens. I can look at the world today and look at all the people talking about Bigfoot and go, yeah, Bigfoot is obviously a cryptid. For something in the past, though, which is inherently probabilistic, I have to kind of make it depend on how willing I am to call it a cryptid, rather than if it is or isn't a cryptid. But anyway, when I'm discussing later on about stuff of how the relevance, comprised of both popularity and engagement, surrounding gorilla narratives in the accompanying discussion, may have had an impact on how willing I am to call gorillas at certain times cryptids, that's what I meant. Do you understand? If you do, honestly, a round of applause for you, my friend. When I wrote the script for all of this, I don't think I really understood all that I wrote, nor do I narrating this video for you. Live update from the editing room. I'm still not totally sure what's going on. And the future me that I hope is still alive at the time of upload probably still doesn't get it, so go make fun of him, I guess. And maybe consider subscribing too while you're at it. As you can tell from the title, this is a video for what should be a series. One that I hope you just subscribed your way into watching future installments of what I, God willing, hope to do here. This opening preamble of what actually is a cryptid, and how do we go about determining that, along with just the fun treasures of natural history, is what I, the creator of this video, am most motivated to understand, using the study of so-called former cryptids as that educational mechanism. I hope this opening segment, which I will in some way have to do every time I shoot one of these videos, becomes more succinct and accurate as the series hopefully progresses. Therefore, if you so please, I invite any challenges to my reasoning throughout this video, but especially for this section. With that said, there will be two main lenses I'll be giving data for, and then examining under that framework. First is the European world, which, to be more particular, is like the Greco-Roman era Mediterranean world up until industrial-aged Western Europe. Pretty much all of the data I'll be using throughout this video is filtered through them, so not only will this just be a longer section, but it is in my opinion beneficial to familiarize you with some of the material here so that you may be better able to interpret later topics regarding our other realm of focus, which are of course the cultures that shared a continent with gorillas pretty much as far back as human history goes. We'll be working with less data here, but still enough to where I think some useful extrapolations can be made. Overall, though, expect a lot more speculation. And I also feel that I can't move forward without mentioning that I think it's very possible that some gorilla accounts may be hidden elsewhere in older sources from perhaps the Indian or Islamic worlds. But I have admittedly not even really attempted to search there, partially because much less documents from them have been digitized compared to my cultural sphere, and especially in any reasonably searchable or accessible way. But primarily because I don't even really know how to navigate those parts of the internet, even if it was available somewhere. If I ever come back to revisit this topic, I hope that at that point I actually have the experience to, follow up on those suspicions. Maybe one day. And for one more final thing for you to anticipate throughout this video, there is actually one more realm of focus that we could perhaps say viewed gorillas as cryptids. And despite me, the creator of this video, not knowing anything in particular about you, the viewer, I'd personally expect that your ancestors, and maybe even you still, could be put in this category. And beyond that, we have some final disclaimers before we start. And I'll try to be quick, I don't want to hold you any longer. 1. I've omitted any purely artistic or visual accounts that some people have pointed to as potentially having gorillas, as they are all way too ambiguous for me to even try and make a judgment, and generally not in ways that favor gorillas. But critically, they tend to lack accounts for the interpretation of the image given, which is key in determining the anticipatory element necessary for something to be a cryptid. The only one I consider worth sharing is this one from, I think, Iran or somewhere else in Central Asia, sometime around the 5th century AD. If you want my thoughts on it, there should be a little text wall on screen. 2, as far as, well, all my other sources that I do plan on making some real claims from. Links to them should be in the description, hopefully within a few days of the upload. I'd like to organize them first. It'd feel kinda rude to just dump, honestly, I think hundreds of links at this point into my description all at once. So if there are any early viewers interested in following up on my research, which I really hope there's somebody, I don't want to be the only one this interested in this topic, then, well, you know where to look now. 3. Pay attention to my language regarding the terminology for different apes. This video covers a lot of different time periods and places, so what people meant and how they used names varied a lot. To use orangutan as an example, there were times where that meant exactly what you thought of in your head when I said that, but it was also often used as applicable to all great apes. And during times when people thought adult apes and juvenile apes might actually be different species, yes, there was a time when that was the case, sometimes orangutan was only applied to the larger apes. So just be wary. I'll try my best to indicate how you should interpret what I'm saying. Pay attention to qualifiers. Our orangutans instead of just orangutans. What we would recognize as orangutans, or his orangutan. Disclaimer 4, the names used to describe our chimpanzees, our orangutans, and what appeared to actually be gorillas varied a lot in spelling. But so did most words in every language for nearly all of history. That's just kinda how it is, but I wanted to give you a heads up. And disclaimer 5, I guess. Chimpanzees and bonobos are the same thing up until like 1933. So anytime I or a previous author refer to the quantity of great ape species as being less than 4, that's why. And with all of those things said, let's begin going through our data. And I guess saying it like that might make it sound kinda boring, but trust me, there are some very interesting stories throughout here. And it pays off in some admittedly goofy discussions that I still fully intend on taking seriously for whatever reason. Beginning with, as I said, the Greco-Roman era Mediterranean cultures up through industrialized Western Europe, there's one early account that I'd like to devote a special focus to. If you search online, were gorillas cryptids, or any adjacent question, you will mostly, or often only, be pointed to this single source. It's one of the more interesting stories relating to this topic, for which I may one day make an entire video dedicated to, so I'll try to be quick, I think. Our first testimony comes from the Periplus of Hanno. It is a text that details the voyage of a so-called Hanno the Navigator, some high-ranking Carthaginian official, possibly even a king, leading a purportedly massive expedition through the Strait of Gibraltar and down the west coast of Africa. The events described, assuming at least some variation of them actually happened, most likely date to sometime in the 5th or 6th century BC, and would have been originally written down in Punic, but at some point translated to and preserved in Greek, which is how we know of it today. It, for the most part, documents what you'd expect of it. Descriptions of the environment and their inhabitants, the settlements they established, and the chronology and navigation of their periplus. And I just gotta say, there is something about the word periplus that makes this text sound way cooler and way longer than it actually is. It's like 3 pages long. I have heard some scholars on the topic say that it could be longer, and that all we have left is a more truncated version. Not going to comment on that, but I thought I should say that. But anyway, it functions very much as a logbook and is standardly broken up into 18 parts. from which it is the final one that is of interest to us in this video. To set the scene a little, the Carthaginians' journey had began well, founding multiple cities and acquiring knowledge of potentially useful connections and resources, but by this point at the apparent end of their journey, they seemingly had been going through a bit of a rough patch, with mostly unfruitful interactions and perhaps even encountering an erupting volcano, and it is after days or weeks of that, they reached a bay that was called the Horn of the South, regarding which they gave this description. In the recess of this bay there was an island, like the former one, having a lake, in which there was another island, full of savage men. There were women, too, an even greater number. They had hairy bodies, and the interpreters called them Gorillæ. When we pursued them, we were unable to take any of the men, for they all escaped, by climbing the steep places and defending themselves with stones. But we took 3 of the women, who bit and scratched their leaders, and would not follow us. So we killed them and flayed them, and brought their skins to Carthage, for we did not voyage further, provisions failing us. Some scholars have hypothesized that that last little line there was added in to make up for an original lost ending. Sorry, I couldn't resist talking about it. But anyway, I'm sure you recognized the word Gorillæ there, obviously very similar to our word gorilla. This is, of course, not a coincidence. This story is what would inspire Savage and Wyman to name their creature as such, although they individually didn't seem to really have any strong opinions on if their gorilla and Hanno's gorilla were one and the same. For our purposes, though, were they actually? Well, I spent a long time thinking about this question before realizing that it doesn't actually matter. I'll still give you my answer on it, but I want to use this as an opportunity to emphasize something important. Here is a point that I already sort of had, but will reiterate many times throughout this video. Our interest is not primarily of if an account actually depicts gorillas, or even the authenticity of any given narrative, but largely on how its audience interpreted it. These, of course, naturally overlap a lot, as the outlandish characteristics that would cause a reader or listener to imagine a gorilla are more likely to be communicated by someone who actually had an authentic experience involving a gorilla, but that nuance is still important. So with that said, how did previous audiences perceive Hanno's gorilla? As I said, there are 2 broad areas to apply this question to: the Mediterranean through the Greco-Roman period, and Western Europe from about the 16th century to the mid-18th century. Beginning with our focus on the Mediterranean, the reason I specify the period instead of just referring to the culture itself is because I want to discuss the potential Carthaginian interpretation, which will necessitate me finally giving you my opinion on what Hanno's gorilla was. And I don't think it was a gorilla. I've switched back and forth so many times. Right now, I land on chimpanzee. Ignoring questions about if this even happened or the text's reliability, there are just a lot of good arguments supporting both humans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. It would take so long to explain why I basically wrote a script for another video at this point, so I'm just going to ask you to trust my opinion on this. My best guess here is actually necessary because there are no other sources we can go to ascertain how their culture interpreted it. Thus, I'm going to do some speculation on what could have been transmitted orally. Follow my reasoning here. The story itself can be hypothesized to have had some cultural relevance. It is communicated as the experiences of, as I said, a king or some other important official. Therefore, the wider public probably would have given credibility and importance to it. And we can see that sort of indicated in later foreign sources, in which reports of those skins being brought back and even hung up in temples are preserved. So if these hypothetically were gorillas, and perhaps even the king was going around explaining in more detail what it actually was, and this story is as popular as it appears to have possibly been, both by the glimpses we can see into Carthaginian society and just how much it was preserved in Greco-Roman culture, then a mythos of gorillas could have potentially been built up in the Carthaginian worldview, one that maybe we could recognize as being similar to how we describe cryptids. Like I said, I don't actually think Hanno's Gorillæ were our gorilla, so ultimately that's all uninfluential, but I had to say it anyway. Moving on to my promised broader focus on how this story was interpreted in classical antiquity, there are a surprising amount of possible references. Examining what is relevant, most are just Hanno and the Carthaginians' activity beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, or other narratives that seem to include echoes from the Periplus, and some of these may include details that stem from Hanno's Gorillæ account specifically. A lot of those, though, are on such a technical level that I don't really think they're worth discussing, so the only ones that I'll talk about here are the three that I think undisputably reference Hanno's Gorillæ. First is Pomponius Mela, a writer in geography of around the mid-1st century AD, who pretty plainly considers our mystery creatures to be human women. Second is Pliny the Elder, writing a little bit later in that century, who, although still calls them women, appears to also lump them in with gorgons, which I didn't see that coming either. If you don't recognize that term, it's one of the things that Medusa was. And third is another man named Silenus, writing probably sometime in the 3rd century. He would follow Pliny's lead by also associating these women with gorgons, though it's a little unclear if he actually thought they were the same thing. One of the reasons this sounds so weird is that at this point in time it is possible that the text of the Periplus itself was out of circulation, and other available stories that did use Hanno and his navigations as some kind of plot device may have muddied the waters a bit. So seeing that among the explicit references to Hanno's gorillas, not even something that is excluding humans, broadly simian is correlated with it, I think it is time to expand our search beyond classical antiquity, as we don't really have any other possible references from this time period, which I'll admit is kinda disappointing, but things get interesting from this point on. So, keeping our finger on Hanno's Periplus for now, after this time period, it was resigned and preserved within Eastern European monasteries, being exclusively there probably up until the decades before or after the fall of Constantinople in the mid-1400s. There it seems to have been stuck in historical irrelevance, as the only references to it, or at least details from it, within this transition period are some scattered regurgitations of details Pliny had given, since he had been preserved in the West, but among those I found no reference to the Gorillæ. At some point proximate to this time frame, it had made its way to the West again, ultimately appearing in print for the first time in 1533. And before I get actually, I know AE at the end of words in Greek is the way that they make things plural. At least I think that's how it goes. But I'm keeping it that way so that when I say Gorillæ, you know I'm referring to Hanno's gorillas, even though he probably didn't pronounce it anything like gorillas. But anyway, it is at the start of this time period where the discussion becomes a little bit more complicated, because from the first publication and on up until Savage and Wyman's discoveries, it appears to have been a pretty relevant source in discussions on Africa, especially early on in the Age of Exploration, and also as an important geopolitical tool. I'm not going to explain that last part. The relevant thing about this is that a lot of these republications or references often feature pretty in-depth discussions on the true nature of Hanno's mysterious hairy woman. A lot of it does follow in the footsteps of Pliny and continues to associate them with gorgons, thus relegating them to myth in the minds of most readers. But the discussion does also move forward quite a lot too, as among these there are some authors that seem to associate Hanno's Gorillæ with some of the potentially authentic gorilla narratives of their time, long before the official discovery of them. These should be momentarily described along some other narratives that'll probably interest you. This fact, though, becomes really strange and honestly a little disappointing to me, because as far as I can tell, the discussions on Hanno's Gorillæ went pretty much unaddressed by any academics of natural history in their writings on great apes, from the time the account entered into Western circulation, up until about the final decade prior to the official discovery of what we now call gorillas. This all comes together to provide my expectation that the only time and place that Hanno's story of the Gorillæ may have in some way worked to build up to the anticipation of our gorillas in a way that we would recognize as cryptid-like is in the Western world during the late Renaissance, Enlightenment, and industrial periods. Abnormally, however, this impact seems to be largely confined to either historians, people just interested in the information of the text, or any type of traveler, people interested in the text for practical endeavors. But sadly not the audience that would probably be the most interested in studying it, being any kind of naturalist. That was a lot, but if you look up the history of gorillas, how they got their name, or potential prediscovery accounts of gorillas, this is pretty invariably the first thing you'll be pointed to. I'm excited to do, hopefully, a more in-depth video on it one day, but to start I thought it was appropriate to give the story some of its flowers now. Moving on from this one-off story and onto the data that'll make up most of our analysis, I'll begin by breaking our subsection of Western culture from the late Renaissance to the Industrial Age itself into two more categories. First are all of the travelogues and papers involving great apes before the year 1800, and second are just those same things but after the year 1800, with the additional inclusion of some cultural references to great apes. There's nothing inherently special about the year 1800, I just happened to catch on to a distinct change in atmosphere that occurred near the turn of the 19th century. The first era is characterized by the genesis of a lot of our most reliable accounts, which would eventually captivate the interest of later academics, who often failed to properly distinguish between our chimps, our orangutans, and our gorillas, but were still willing to recognize that they weren't really sure about much, which itself coincided with a greater relevance to contemporary culture. And there is also, I guess, a technical third time period between the official discovery of gorillas in 1847 up until Paul du Chaillu's return from Africa at the end of the 1850s, during which gorillas had technically been discovered but still unencountered. If we can properly gauge the popular and scholarly reception to gorilla accounts accurately across these three time periods, we may find it fitting to say gorillas were indeed cryptids across these cultures for who knows how long, so let's begin. Beginning with everything before the year 1800, I believe we can approach this most effectively by looking at it through the lens of four key sources, and I'll explain why they are uniquely useful for this in a moment. But to introduce them, I consider the earliest of these to come in 1766 from the prominent French naturalist Georges de Buffon in the 14th volume of his Natural History. The next comes from instead a Welsh naturalist, his name Thomas Pennant, in his 1771 work, Synopsis of Quadrupeds, and not too long after that is a publication from the eccentric linguist and judge James Burnet, also going by the moniker Lord Monboddo, in his 1774 of the Origins and Progress of Language, and finally is Carl Linnaeus's lifelong work of Systema Naturae. It was a continually updating work meant to, systematize nature. It was foundational in concepts of animal taxonomy, but for our purposes it functions well as a way to track knowledge over the 1700s. The first edition was in 1735, so way before any of the others, and what are considered the final editions were made over a decade after his death by one of his students in the early 1790s, so also way after the others. The specific parts of these publications that are of interest to us, although for each author directed towards different ends, are all enabled by the author attempting to make sense of some accounts of wild men or human-like animals, which had been pouring into Europe for a while at that point. These four were uniquely equipped for understanding all of that as they operated towards the end of our time period. So, to emphasize an important point, none of these men are our primary sources, which is intentional, as we are interested in people's interpretation of authentic accounts, and these individuals provide both those potential sources and important commentary. Seeing that 3 out of the 4 of these men were respected experts of natural history, we can expect that most people looking to form an opinion on this subject probably would have just gone to one of these guys as an authority figure, adopting their view and maybe spreading it. Technically, Buffon could be considered a primary source. An associate of his showed him what is probably just a young chimp, with, maybe the small chance that it was a young gorilla too. But anyway, to start, these 4 men gave reference to a total of 51 other people of interest, who themselves referenced even more people, 26 of which I considered worth investigating. From this collective, There are 18 individuals who I was only able to know of through the reference of another person listed here, either by the individual's historical obscurity or just unclear citations. Although for 4 of them, I thought I may have been able to make a confirmation, but it was just too unclear to make a call. Regarding the remaining, who I was able to confidently ascertain the identity of, there were 8 who I thought I may have been able to find a probable source for, but was limited by having no reasonably accessible way to verify it, and 41 that I was able to successfully view the contents of. And amongst this totality, there were actually 27 people of interest who I found to have had even the slightest suggestion of referencing a gorilla, again either by their own testimony or by being referenced in another account, which I've further compressed into 10 distinct narratives. Although I personally am more interested in the reception of these stories rather than the contents of them, as that is what will determine if gorillas were indeed cryptids. I recognize that most of you in the audience are probably just interested in how people who didn't know of gorillas reacted to learning of their existence for the first time, and what was said of them during those times, which I'll gladly indulge. These range from passing mentions to pretty vividly described encounters that could take minutes to read at a time, so I'll quote verbatim or just summarize at my own discretion. I'll, for the most part, refrain from discussing credibility, although for a few things that will come up way later on in the video. And of course, links should be in the description, hopefully within a few days of the upload. And there should be timestamps on screen if you want to skip any individual one, or all of them if you so please. But I personally recommend listening to the 2nd testimony, the 8th testimony, and the 11th testimony, at least. Hanno's narrative counts as the 1st testimony if you're confused by the numbering there. But, of course, I hope you listen to all of them. I find them all pretty interesting. Testimony 2. Battel's Pongo. Beginning with one of our earlier sources, we will now discuss what is probably the 2nd most circulated story regarding this question of if gorillas are cryptids, or, again, any adjacent question like that. If you put something along those lines into a search engine, this is probably the 2nd story you would encounter. Samuel Purchas, in his 1625 edition of his book, Purchas's Pilgrims, reports on the description of a creature called the Pongo, relayed to him by a former English sailor, or pirate, Andrew Battel. Battel had previously been residing in Portuguese-occupied Angola for nearly 2 decades, from the late 1500s to the early 1600s. The description is begun by introducing 2 monsters of the woods. The first is our Pongo, which is described as the greater, and the second is the Ngeko, which is described as the lesser. This Ngeko, whose name would eventually get turned into Joko, you'll find out by who in a moment, was consistently interpreted as a chimpanzee, which left confusion on what exactly the Pongo was, for which I will now read you its description. This Pongo is in all proportion like a man, but that he is more like a giant in stature than a man, for he is very tall, and hath a man's face, hollowed eyes, with long hairs upon his brows. His face and ears are without hair, and his hands also. His body is full of hair, but not very thick, and it is of a dunnish colour. He differeth not from a man, but in his legs, for they have no calf. He goeth always upon his legs, and carrieth his hands clasped around the nape of his neck, when he goeth upon the ground. They sleep in the trees, and build shelters for the rain. They feed upon fruit that they find in the woods, and upon nuts, for they eat no kind of flesh. They cannot speak, and have no understanding more than a beast. The people of the country, when they travel in the woods, make fires where they sleep in the night, and in the morning, when they are gone, the Pongos will come and sit about the fire, till it goeth out, for they have no understanding to lay the wood together. They go many together, and kill many locals that travel in the woods. Many times they fall upon the elephants, which come to feed where they be, and so beat them with their clubbed fists, and pieces of wood, that they will run roaring away from them. Those Pongos are never taken alive, because they are so strong that 10 men cannot hold one of them, but yet they take many of their young ones with poisoned arrows. The young Pongo hangeth upon his mother's belly, with his hands fast clasped about her, so that, when the country people kill any of the females, they take the young one which hangeth fast upon his mother, When they die among themselves, they cover the dead with great heaps of boughs and wood, which is commonly found in the forests. Off in the margins of the page is found an even more illuminating account. The Pongo or giant ape, he, being Battel, told me in conference with him, took a young local boy of his, which lived a month with them, for they hurt not those which they surprise at unawares, except they look on them, which he avoided. He said, their height was like a man, but their bigness twice as great, saw the local boy. That there is the one long account that I will be reading out to you in full, and really there isn't much I can add to that. It's an account that talks for itself for the most part. In terms of physical description, I don't know how you could say that is anything else other than a gorilla. There's some behavioral wonkiness, I'll admit, especially regarding the elephant turf wars, which I've taken to calling those. It's a motif that will pop up multiple times later on. But there's also insights here that we wouldn't recognize until hundreds and hundreds of years later, like how they don't like eye contact, mourning rituals, building shelters. This is just straight up a cool account. Interestingly, the first English translation of Hanno's Periplus would be published by purchase in this very book, and in his commentaries he would connect Hanno's Gorillæ with Battel's Pongos. This account would become the most often circulated and relied upon work regarding the concept of uniquely large African apes, and for whatever my opinion is worth, I am pretty overwhelmingly confident that these were genuinely gorillas. Testimony 3. Nonfoux Orangutan. This is one that I'm including for more practical reasons, I guess. There's some data and context that shows up here, which I want you to be already familiar with for some discussions that'll happen later in the video, even if the exact specimen I'm discussing here doesn't really have much of an impact on if gorillas are cryptids. And it is this story that I was talking about when I said Buffon could technically be considered a primary source, as what will henceforth be described appears in the 14th volume of his Natural History. To give some context, at that point in his discussion he had already referenced multiple times things that appear to have been gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees, and his struggles throughout that had been his attempts to properly understand the stories of larger great apes, for which he has adopted the name Pongo, obviously derived from Battel's Pongos, and the stories of smaller apes, for which he has adopted the name Joko, derived from Battel's Ngeko. I'll hold off on what his conclusions on that matter was for now, but in the midst of giving that personal opinion of his, he tells of his own encounter with an ape specimen, dating to sometime in the mid-1700s. Quote, that which I saw was about 2 feet and a half tall. Mr. Nonfoux, to whom it belonged, affirms that it was not above 2 years old. Therefore, it possibly might have attained the height of 5 feet if it had lived, supposing its growth proportionate to that of the human species. End quote. Beyond that, he tells of some behavioral and temperamental stuff that could be seen as characteristics of our orangutans, our chimpanzees, and our gorillas, or at least younger specimens of those, and also a lot of unnatural stuff which they could still nonetheless perform either out of reward or punishment. There's really no way to know what exactly this is. Could be a young gorilla, could be a young chimp. I'd bet on that. As you'll see later, those two things did get mixed up at some points. But importantly, a lot of Buffon's most important insights are communicated in the context of this account. We'll be covering that later, and your familiarity with the term Joko is actually important for some stuff that comes up later on too. This, in my opinion, is probably the most skippable account, so let's move on. Testimony 4. The Barris. It is first attested to sometime very early in the 1600s. By Jesuit missionary Pierre du Harric, who would give this description. There are all sorts of birds and other animals found in the rest of Guinea, especially a great variety of monkeys. Among others one finds a certain species, called Barris, which are large and strong, and which have such cleverness that, if one raises and trains them when young, they serve as if they were a person, for they usually walk on only their 2 hind feet, and pound what is given to them in mortars. They go fetch water from the river in little jars, which they carry full upon their heads, but arriving at the door of the house, if someone does not quickly take the jars from them, they let them fall to the ground, and seeing the water spilled and the jar broken, they begin to weep and cry. How sad! And also, when he says Guinea, don't think of any of the modern countries with the name Guinea in it. It, I believe, more broadly referred to equatorial Africa anywhere on the western coast of the continent. This account would be cited by Juan Eusebio Nuremberg, another Jesuit missionary, a few decades after this, and expanded on further by a report shortly after that by the Catholic priest and academic Pierre Gassendi. And then further into the 1700s, tell of the Barris would be referred to once again by the slave trader John Barbeau. Just going off of what was given to us by Duharic, that seems pretty ambiguous. Both its size, strength, and intelligence are all pretty stressed. Gassendi, who himself is relying on two other sources, who although still refers to them as large, really seems to stress their intelligence. Not only in their description, but also of what they are said to do. They only need to be taught something once. They're made to wear clothes. They play music. They cook. Other household chores. Both his sources even say they look smart, having white, grayish beards. And I had never noticed this throughout my whole life until making this video, but chimpanzees have pretty distinct white facial hair, so Gassendi's implication is pretty obvious in my opinion. Barbeau corroborates a lot of that minus the beard thing, and further describes them as being hunted by locals and really enjoying oysters, but importantly making an emphasis of, in his words, a monstrous size. So, what do we do with all of that? Each account seems to describe them as large and strong to a gorilla-like degree, but also an intelligence that is more characteristic of chimpanzees and even a few descriptions that are unique to them. I'm gonna assume a composite theory here. Either this is a local term that is applicable to both gorillas and chimps, or a word that meant chimps but had its understanding muddied by gorillas, or a word that meant gorillas but had its understanding muddied by chimpanzees. Either way, I think the influence of gorillas in these descriptions is pretty undeniable. In the end, the most memorable thing about this for me is my new curiosity on if some of the indigenous African cultures had deeper connections and relationships with apes, but especially gorillas, than I had previously imagined. Testimony 5. Merolla's Wildmen. This one will be a bit more brief and vague. Told to us by the Capuchin missionary to Congolese and Angolan Africa, Girolamo Merolla, towards the end of the 1600s, we are given this passage. At some huntings there have been taken in this country both the wild men and women, which to confirm, Father Leonard once told me that before my coming hither there had been one of that kind presented to a friar of our order, which was again bestowed by him on the Portuguese governor of Luanda, based on the context of the preceding and following paragraphs. He seems to have understood this as a kind of animal, but not a species of monkey. If you assume authenticity to this report, you are left with either chimps, gorillas, or the more dark option of humans. I'm critical of that latter option, as if this was just humans killing each other, I would have expected Merolla to either describe it as warfare, or at least in some sort of negative light. Trying to read into this a little bit further, I guess. I suppose the fact that whatever was killed was worth parading around in their eyes would make it more likely that it was gorillas, I think. Especially considering that the governor it was said to have been brought to, being in Luanda, is outside of any historical ape ranges, which means this really had to be something worth seeing. So it probably could be any, but I think in this particular case, gorillas might actually be my best guess. That's certainly the funnest option for me. So you know what? I'm gonna believe it. Testimony 6. Dapper's Worrou. Told to us by Ulfr Dapper in around 1670. This account is kinda just a confusing jumble of descriptions, and is spread across two sections of his at the time famous work, Description of Africa. I say this sympathetically since he was trying his best with what he had, but it is probably the best example of contemporary authors having absolutely no clue what was going on and inevitably failing to make any accurate sense of it. He makes reference to things we can pretty definitively recognize as what we would call orangutans and chimpanzees, and seems to just lump them all into one whole creature having an eastern and western variety. What he calls a Worrou, Koyas Moru, salvage or savage. In congruence with the subject of his book, he is chiefly interested in reports of that western variety, which again, based on some references he gives, and also just the fact that they're more common, are pretty easily read as what we now recognize as chimpanzees. This, however, is complicated by a description attributed to the Worrou that one would find more fitting of the gorillas that we're familiar with. But beyond all these is that monstrous creature, which the inhabitants called Worrou. It hath a great head, a heavy body, fleshy arms, and strong, no tail, and goes sometimes upright, and sometimes like an ape on all fours. There's nothing about this that excludes chimps, but it really does sound like gorillas in my opinion. Barbeau, if you remember him from earlier, also references the Worrou, and communicates a lot of the same material as Dapper, giving baboon also as an alternative name. A unique emphasis of this account is an early recognition of the similarity these creatures have to us humans. This manifests fully as the creatures being reported to have descended from humans in a way. To quote a Dapper, the locals report it to be a human extract, but by the alteration and change of the woods in the wilderness, it has become a half-beast. Later in his book, he goes even further. This beast in shape so resembles a man that some have held opinion that it is of a human mixture with an ape. And a bit more darkly is his description of these creatures' involvement with human women, something that I think, if I remember correctly, is also said in the Barris narratives, and I think I forgot to relate it there. Here are two key takeaways. A lens is introduced here, one that would become pretty popular, that doesn't make much of an attempt to distinguish between apes, which would render more distinct and authentic gorilla accounts not even as less likely, but in fact legitimized in a way, as an extension of a more known thing out east, even if, as a consequence, gorillas as a concept would become less distinguished. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And also shown here is one of the earlier recognitions of human and ape similarities. Dapper would become pretty often referred to by academics of the 1700s, and a lot of his understandings would be adopted by them. Dapper appears to have been at least partially inspired by another author, Nicolas Tulp, who wrote about 3 decades earlier. He, like Dapper, makes reference to what we would recognize as chimps, but especially orangutans, and paves the way for Dapper's category error. He does say the African term Worrou, but overall seems to have been unfamiliar with the material that led Dapper to, in my opinion, include details that originated from gorillas. I wasn't really sure what to do with him, because he technically said the word Worrou, which I believe to have some gorilla influence, but that's kinda it, so I kinda just threw him in at the end here. Overall, considering the Worrous, I think it's another composite like the Barris, and I don't really think I lean one way or the other, really. Testimony 7. Gassendi's Grass Eaters. This is an additional account given by Gassendi, if you remember from earlier, after he tells of his Barris sources, and whatever is going on in it hinges completely on a single grammatical uncertainty. It begins by introducing Thomas Diarchos, a traveler and writer who lived during the same time periods as Gassendi, so late 1500s to mid 1600s. Diarchos, a known correspondent of Gassendi's friend Pierski, at some point communicated this account to his friend. Of another man who he had met, who saw another black man, yes, his race is completely relevant here, which hunted what are related to us as wild human-like creatures. Regarding that grammatical uncertainty, let's look at what I'm talking about. To quote Gassendi, Arcosius, in fact, had written in certain letters what had happened to a man from Ferrara, when he was staying in a region of Marmarica called Angela, Marmarica itself being a region on the North African coast. There are 2 ways to interpret this. First is that this is what that man from Ferrara experienced in Marmarica, or second, that Diarchos himself, while in Marmarica, heard this story from that man from Ferrara, which I hate so much how complicated this stupid account is for how stupid it's going to end up being in a minute, but keep listening to me. If the first part is true, then it can't be any kind of ape. However, because of what specifically is said about it, I can't really think of anything else it would be, so I kinda have to choose that second option, which means that man from Ferrara could have been from anywhere, probably somewhere in the habitat of chimpanzees and gorillas. Here's some facts about this so-called wild human-like creature. They are said to be covered in short, soft hair. Both the males and females closely resembled human anatomy, to the point of being mistaken for people. They were frequent enough in their native habitat to be hunted multiple days in a row. They had a mostly vegetarian diet. And finally, we can reasonably assume that these creatures' fur probably had black pigmentation due to this truly incredible interaction. One day he, the man from Ferrera, happened upon a black man who was hunting using dogs, what seemed to be wild human-like creatures. After one of them was captured and killed, the Italian rebuked the black man for cruelty against his own kind. But the man replied, "You are mistaken. This is not a human being, but a beast that merely resembles one. Indeed, it feeds only on grass, and it has the intestines of a sheep. To help you believe me, look here," and he opened the creature's abdomen. And then both of them went hunting together the next day. Straight up, this ain't gorillas. I do not care. It made me laugh, and I think I went a little insane when I tried to figure all of this out. So, shouting into the void that is my microphone, I must do. Testimony 8. Bros's Quimpeazas. This is another account that we really only know of through Buffon, who details the experiences of a friend of his, Charles de Brosses, during his travels to Angola in 1738. He writes of a creature called Quimpeazas, so you would assume that these were just what we now call chimpanzees. However, as far as I can tell, the original word itself, which comes from a Bantu-speaking group along the Angolan coast, just appears to denote a broad category of apes. The first known use of the word chimpanzee or any similar variant also happens to be from 1738, in a print that illustrates what can be pretty clearly recognized as a chimpanzee, however also featuring a description that seems to include elements from known gorilla narratives, with some parts of the description seeming to imply that either the inquirer or the engraver of this image may have interacted with someone that was in some way at least familiar with gorillas. I guess my point in saying all of that is that don't read too much into the word Quimpeazas. So looking at what Brosses himself does say about these creatures, we find stuff that could be reasonably told about either chimps or gorillas. Following in the footsteps of some already discussed accounts, we see another implication of sexual deviancy among them. We'll get into that way later in the video, but we also see other stuff like tool use, building shelters, or facial descriptions, stuff like broad faces, flat nose, rounded ears, even fair skin, maybe, at least partially covered in long and tawny hair. That's a bit more accurate. The ability to be both bipedal and quadrupedal, also pretty accurate. But here is the standout quote from this passage. "I knew," says Brosses, "a woman from Luango that had lived among these animals for 3 years. They grew from 6 to 7 feet high, and are of unequaled strength." So, yeah. That sounds like gorillas to me. Or, to be honest, that doesn't actually sound like gorillas, technically. Out in the wild, it is actually pretty rare to get them over 6 feet tall, if I remember. So, an exaggerated image of gorillas, to be more accurate. Overall, though, these so-called Quimpeazas are probably just another composite of gorillas and chimps, or just chimpanzees that had their understanding muddied by gorilla stories. And despite what I said earlier about not reading too much into the name Quimpeazas, I would personally lean towards the second option on this one. Testimony 9. Le Comte's Barbarians. This next account is pretty simple. It features Louis Le Comte, or however you would pronounce this dude's last name. Another Jesuit. A lot of Jesuits in this video. Shout out to the Jesuits, I guess. But whatever. He wrote in 1699 about what are pretty clearly are orangutans. He writes of a creature called the Savage Man living in Borneo, and reports them as being anatomically very similar to humans, extraordinarily strong, capable of bipedal movement, fast, apparently even trophy animals, and all over quite hairy. But more importantly for our purposes, we should, in his words, reckon them equally men with certain barbarians in Africa, who do not much differ from beasts. How many of those aforementioned traits ought to be imputed to these barbarians is left unsaid. But given the already established confusion in just lumping all apes together by this point, I just assume it was as well that, the general concept of an ape, which I guess I would expect to at least be partially contributed to by gorillas. So I guess I'll count it, but this is so vague to where I wouldn't blame you for considering it unimportant. Testimony 10. Bosman's Other Apes. This is another account that I'll try to be similarly brief with. It features Willem Bosman, a Dutch merchant, writing in a 1704 publication of a creature called the Smitten, which pretty inarguably kinda has to be a chimpanzee going off of reported factors like population, physical appearance, behavior, and location. However, that description is just one among 3 sorts of apes Bosman gives. This is the second one. As the former sort of apes are very ugly, so the next are exactly like them. Only 4 of them put together would not be so large as the other, and their best quality is that they are so docile that they will learn whatever they are taught. Given that chimps are already distinguished in what is told of the smitten, the gorilla seems a pretty natural shoe-in here. The only real difference between them seems to be their size, and importantly, it's not talking about their height there. Gorillas and chimps are less separated in height than I realized when I started this video. It's that width and that weight that's the real tell in my opinion. Similar to the Barris narratives, Bosman's other apes are also described as being used in some sort of servile role, which, as somebody who believes those Barris narratives are at least somewhat inspired by gorilla interactions, this double attestation, which appears to be independently sourced, bolster me even more in my curiosity that gorillas and humans may have been more involved than anyone would have previously realized. Or rather, apes and humans, I guess, which I'll admit was probably for the most part chimpanzees. As terrifying as I think chimpanzees are, gorillas give an even more intimidating prospect on how you would get your hands on them and control them after the fact. But sometimes, maybe sometimes, gorillas could have been used there. I'ma just start spitballing, cause I know only other crazy people are listening at this point in the video. Do y'all think that if, like, the continent of Africa had been left alone for 5,000 or so more years, do y'all think we could have gotten, like, domesticated chimpanzees or something? Honestly, that kind of creeps me out now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more. But you have to admit that would be an interesting idea. What would you actually even, like, use them for? The obvious thing is, like, you know, a house servant or something. But could you also use, like, war chimps, maybe? Actually, you know what? Scratch that. Bonobos would have been easier to do that with. Although, actually, I would prefer chimpanzees if I was going to war. But for, like, servile work around the house, maybe manual labor, I guess, farming, carrying stuff and whatnot, I'd probably take bonobos. Although if you could get gorillas, that'd be pretty cool. Domesticating gorillas sounds kinda far-fetched though. And when I think about this a bit further, some African kingdom totally could have become like a world superpower if they did this correctly. Ignoring any moral questions and just looking at it from a pragmatic lens, it's just slavery, but you don't have to worry about going out and conquering another tribe of people. And you don't have to worry about revolts as much too. And even better, you control the entire supply of them. They are only in your very specific part of the world. And as you'll see later in the video, they usually don't do that well outside of like equatorial environments. Just a quick thought I had while I was recording this, but I should really get a move on. This video is stupidly long at this point. So with that said, Testimony 11, Monboddo's Impungu. This one is a contender for my favorite among this whole bunch of stories. It is an exclusive of James Burnet's reporting, and it disappointingly seems to have not really caught on in popularity. But even if it did, I'm hesitant to expect that it would have been taken that seriously. As you'll see momentarily, there are some pretty rampant exaggerations. The information given to Monboddo is communicated to him by a Mr. Bell, who apparently had worked as the governor of an African slaving port for a few years sometime prior. This man, according to Burnet, himself gives 2 more sources. First is a, quote, credible merchant and his son, and second is an English surgeon, who is also unnamed. The father and son pair never even claim to see it. They, presumably, are relating stories told to them by the locals. So, as you can see, everything here has already gone through a pretty lengthy game of telephone. But to start, our merchant gives us 3 creatures, all having no tail. The Impungu, the Chimpanzee, and the Itsena. Regarding the Impungu, for now just recall back to Patel's Pongo. Burnet considers them to be the same, as do I, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Regarding the chimpanzee, as mentioned earlier, the similarity in name probably means there are chimps. Not necessarily, but in this case I think the description really backs that up. Their height is a little undersized, but I think the description of the Itsena fills that void. Not much is given about that creature, other than that it just appears to be a taller chimpanzee. Really, it just seems like for whatever reason there was a distinction between mature and immature chimpanzees. Going back to the Impungus, though, I feel pretty confident that those are the gorillas that we're familiar with. The name and location given for these creatures is obviously very reminiscent of Battel's story, but furthermore, their description is even more striking than the one he gives. The first and largest is, by the natives of Loengo, Malemba, Cabenda, and Congo, called or named Impungu. This wonderful and frightful production of nature walks upright like a man, is from 7 to 9 feet high, when at maturity, thick in proportion and amazingly strong, covered with longish hair, jet black all over the body, but longer on the head, the face more like a human than the chimpanzee, but the complexion black, and has no tail. Beyond that, Mr. Bell provides some dietary and behavioral peculiarities about the Impungu, and gives some more details about their size, remarking that a young one could be 6.5 feet tall, and the immense proportion of their hands and wrists compared to a man's. Most interesting, though, is their activities with the natives, with stories about both parties kidnapping and harming each other. The unnamed surgeon from earlier doesn't really add too much. He confirms a lot of physical descriptions, but instead this time by the virtue of his own examination, claiming to have measured one at 8 feet in height. Alright, what do we do with all this? The simplest explanation is that somebody is almost certainly lying, and that's kind of about it. It actually does seem possible that gorillas can reach 7 feet in captivity, but only captivity. And it seems so rare that I can't really even give a statistic about how rare that is, which itself is quite a good indicator that this is extremely rare, and that's glossing over the claims of 8 or 9 feet tall. Either way, the subject matter that is being exaggerated I can only imagine as being gorillas, which is a pretty good note to end off with regarding all the potentially authentic narratives from our 4 original guys. But you know what? I have 2 more bonus ones for you that could potentially be authentic gorilla narratives. They're connected to some early commentaries on the Periplus of Hanno, and one of them may possibly contain the earliest written reference to gorillas, assuming of course that Hanno's Gorillæ weren't our gorillas. That's kinda just how commentaries work. But anyway, Testimony 12, Bougainville's Impungu. I wonder what this one relates to. Coming in 1764, this account is communicated to us by Antoine de Bougainville. He held important roles in military and or maritime endeavors throughout his life. And for the geography nerds watching this, you know that one island off the coast of Papua New Guinea that everybody has been saying will become a country one day? Yeah, that one is named after him. There isn't really much to say here. It reconfirms a lot of the things in Battel's account, and like Monboddo, directly refers to him as a comparison. The context of his discussion, one that I've also had with myself, is what were Hanno's Gorillæ? In an attempt to first ground these as real creatures, he delivers to us this passage. The island of gorillas, or wild woman, is one of those islands which one encounters in great numbers in the sea. The neighboring regions are full of such animals, which resemble wild people. According to the account of one Portuguese sailor, who is one of the commentators on Hanno, such forests still stretch across the inner part of Africa. The locals unanimously call these animals Impungu, or something similar, and consider them to be people of the forest. And that's really all we can say about it. They are wild people of the forest, which probably more so just refers to chimpanzees and gorillas. But this does seem to confirm the use of Pongo-adjacent names, so I think we can reasonably hope that gorillas are mixed into here somewhere. When we're dealing with such a niche topic, any bit of attestation helps. And to comment a little bit more on this, when the passage referred to that unnamed Portuguese sailor, I was a little worried that was actually talking about Battel himself. He was British, but he stayed in a Portuguese colony for like 18 years if I remember correctly, so it isn't unlikely that his nationality or ethnicity could be mixed up. But just going off of the wording of the passage, that doesn't seem to be the case. With that said, I'm using ChatGPT to translate this, which overall I've actually heard is good at translating, especially older stuff. But just take it with a grain of salt, I guess. And as one more little nugget of information, the translation I'm using here seems to suggest that Pongo or any alternative pronunciations may mean something like traveler in the native language. I'm personally quite skeptical of that due to some information that we'll get to later in the video, but I thought you should know that that's at least an option. Testimony 13. Ramusio's Babuini. This story is less likely to have gorilla-based origins, but if it does, it is by far the earliest, as the publication of it appears in 1550 inside the book Navigations and Travels. The events described could have happened earlier, but we don't really have a way of figuring that out. Coming once again in the context of a discourse on the Periplus of Hanno, Giovanni Ramusio, our author, gives reference to an unnamed seaman who made this speculation of Hanno. Being ambitious to make the world believe that he too had gone there by sea, and to give fame to his voyage as if he had penetrated as far as Perseus, he wished to bring 2 hides of the Gorgons and dedicate them in the temple of Juno, which was easy to do, since along all that coast are found countless of those great apes, which resemble human beings, called baboons, whose skins he could easily have made everyone believe were those of women. Okay, so first, this individual was still working with the popular misconception that Hanno's Gorillæ were meant to be read as Gorgons, but really that's just his speculation. What we're interested in is the evidence he used to support that speculation, even if we in the modern day know he misapplied it. And thus, second, about that evidence, your immediate question at this point is probably, does baboons, or the old Italian babuini, actually refer to my conception of baboons in this case? Yes and no. Just doing some very surface level Googling, the general sense I got is that our word baboons has its origins in various Western European people's descriptions of either the concept of a simpleton, gargoyles, or both. And before our testimony here, it had at some point developed a connection with simians, or what we nowadays would consider simians, sometime maybe in like the 15th century, but may have also had an older connection with the concept of dog-headed apes, what we now call a baboon, and none of this even really began to get formalized until the 19th century. A lot of what I said just feels kind of contradictory and confusing, so here's my take on it. What you imagine in your head when I say baboon potentially may have an application in this scenario, but if there was a traveler who was completely unfamiliar with chimpanzees and apes, and didn't really have a word for them, he might choose this as the closest thing. I'm not totally sure on that. We've had a category for tailless simians, I think since like Aristotle even, because he knew of the Barbary macaque, if I'm thinking correctly. I'm pretty sure it's the one truly tailless monkey species. He gave the word Pithecus for it, and that word was used at the time, but I could still definitely see a random sailor dude who's not familiar with all of that, deciding that babuini is really the closest thing he can choose. I wouldn't have gone through all of the effort to say all of that if I didn't have another thing to bring to the table too. Or things, technically. I have 2 points I want to make. First is that they are apparently very common along the coasts of the Gulf of Guinea. That makes chimps and baboons much more likely. They have a wider range, and inside that range they're pretty common. Gorillas, on the other hand, in their more secluded region of Africa, as far as I've been able to determine, are pretty hard to find even there, especially on the coasts. So, -1 point for gorillas. Point 2, they are similar enough in human anatomy that regarding the skins of the females of this species, he could have easily made everyone believe were those of woman. Keyword easily, which makes whatever these were probably not baboons. So the next closest thing are chimpanzees. Sorry, ladies. If it makes you feel any better, we know this man's standards were actually quite low, as he made a similar description regarding a creature he found on Africa's east coast, which would implicate solely baboons, which kind of implies that whatever was found on the east coast could have really been anything. Did I fix it, ladies? I tried my best, but in the end there, I'm not really sure what's going on. This could be chimpanzees or baboons. I'd personally lean closer to chimpanzees, but there is still a chance that gorillas were involved in here somewhere. And if that slim likelihood were to be true, I couldn't not tell you about it, as this would be a key moment in the development of gorilla knowledge, no matter how irrelevant it as a story eventually became. And with that conclusion there, those are all of the potentially authentic gorilla narratives I managed to collect from this period of interest. Are there probably who knows how many more scattered amongst a graveyard of old and dusty books? Yes, I don't doubt that. This is very likely only a fraction of what's out there, but I'm still quite pleased with what I've found so far. And as I've repeated so many times so far, that's honestly okay for our purposes, as we are chiefly interested in the impact these had on relevant conversations, as that is what I think will make something truly and undeniably a cryptid. So moving away from all of the info dumping, let's quickly touch a base on the key premises of this video. How close did people get to articulating the concept of gorillas? How separated was it as an idea from other known things? How widespread were any of these beliefs? And what level of interest did these conversations and stories invoke? And at long last, I can finally get to the part of the video that I've been itching to get to. What did our four key figures, Buffon, Pennant, Monboddo, and Linnaeus, conjure up in response to all of these accounts? And how culturally relevant was their discussions? If you sat through all of that earlier, you might have some general expectations, but I think you'll find this goes far deeper than you were initially suspecting. And there are other people that I looked into that I could refer to during this section. Edward Tyson, Petrus Camper, Jean Ray, Jean-Baptiste Robinet, Lacepede, Jean-Baptiste de Sales, Charles Bonnet, and I'm probably forgetting a few more. Do either of us want me to cover all of those guys? Because although these individuals are still important, I have found them to be limiting for our purposes, based on factors of either writing too early, having different focuses, sometimes just being inaccessible, and or not bringing anything new to the discussion that I couldn't have derived from one of our original guys. And also, I will admit, I'm a little bit tired. Once I begin working on my next project, I really hope I don't hear, the word gorilla for a month or two. And at this point, chimpanzees and orangutans too. I need an ape detox or something. But anyway, I believe this discussion is best introduced by familiarizing you with the general understanding of apes throughout Western academic history up until the year 1800. Their understanding of different apes and how they each relate to each other can, I believe, best be summarized as this. They didn't know what was going on, but we're at least self-aware of that. Now, to preface that, we are looking at a time period of a bit over 200 years, specifically one that featured the most rapid development in history up to that point. So there were developments, but there are some through lines here that I think are important. At the start of our period of interest, around the 1600s, plus or minus a few decades, they weren't really defined or distinguished because there wasn't even enough information that would prompt you to even try and define and distinguish them. And depending on your criteria, taxonomy as a concept hadn't even been born yet. But by the end, pretty much everyone was aware that definitions and distinctions would need to be made, and some people had even attempted to do so. But any kind of consensus wouldn't really be solidified until the 19th century. In both cases, though, apes were pretty undefined and undistinguished. This confusion, in my opinion, was kind of unavoidable. The knowledge of apes that any academic could hope to obtain would usually come from either 1. Incomplete skeletons or hides imported to Europe, 2. Juvenile specimens that, when brought from their native habitat, would usually die by the first winter. Or 3. Travelers' tales. Some of the most important ones we are now acquainted with. And I guess disclaimer 6 here in the middle of the video. When I say apes, assume I am deliberately excluding gibbons. Yes, they are apes, but I don't feel like saying great apes every time. And in my research, it seems like scientists were kinda always aware that they were a little bit weird. I never really saw them included in the conversations of eerily man-like animals that would dominate later decades. I'll give you 2 examples of just how much this concept of what I'd call the universal great ape would kinda just be the default view for quite a while. First, let's just take the word orangutan. It just means man of the woods in Javan. Now consider that when Europeans began interacting with that part of the world, they pretty much just used it for the great apes of that habitat, which is pretty natural. However, by the time we get to our 4 key authors, it had become a more general purpose term for them. I believe this is partially because that phrase could be used to describe other apes just as validly, hence why you see European translations of it used regularly as well, but also because with the evidence they had, they could be reasonably seen as just the same entity. This was to a point that the known concept of chimps and the more vague idea of a gorilla were often referred to with the language of being Western, Black, or African orangutans, often shortened to just orangs. Second, consider the word Pongo. Everybody who sat through all the accounts earlier, you're already familiar with this. But to briefly re-summarize, that word and some of its alternative spellings is a name used regarding the subject of some of our most authentic and probable gorilla narratives. What you don't know, however, unless you're perhaps a primatologist who's watching this, is that this word Pongo would live on in a rather unexpected but very telling way, in that the word Pongo became very linked with what we would now recognize as orangutans, as to this very day the scientific name for that species is simply just Pongo. The pretty standard theory I've heard for this is that it probably came about from sailors on their way to the East Indies, stopping by Africa on the way, hearing that term from the locals, maybe even seeing one themselves and going, huh, big man like ape in Africa? Big man like ape in Southeast Asia? Must be same. This is a pretty sneaky piece of evidence that makes my confidence in how willing I am to call gorillas cryptids a bit higher. The fact that the name of this creature was able to be transported to another continent, and that it also stuck around, shows that stories of them may have been very popular among the common seafaring man, to a degree that we otherwise wouldn't have been given the initiative to notice. But besides that, these, in my opinion, are two easy testaments to my idea that at the time, apes were kinda just apes. There wasn't that big of a worry about how they should be understood, which is honestly pretty understandable. And this little spiel of mine is, I believe, the cultural context with which we need to examine how our relevant authors reacted to the possibly authentic gorilla narratives that they were aware of, because those are the presuppositions with which the broader culture are working with, and any adjustments they do make will be relative to that. And I will repeat this as many times as it takes. How clearly that understanding is articulated is key in determining if something is undeniably a cryptid. How large and interested that audience is, I will hold off on that for now. Let's finally get to our 4 key sources. Buffon, who I describe as the earliest articulator of a lot of this, I believe is a pretty natural place to start, although he is a little complicated. The opening statement to his relative chapter on this subject introduces the curiosities leading up to and alive during his time quite well. The orangutan, or the Pongo, and the Joko. Orangutan is the name this animal bears in the East Indies, Pongo its denomination at Loando, a province of Congo, and Kakerlax in some parts of the East Indies. We shall present the orangutan and the Joko together, because they are, possibly, but one and the same species. Of all the ape and monkey kind, these bear the greatest resemblance to the human form, and, consequentially, those which are most worthy of our notice. We have seen the small orangutan, or the Joko, alive, and we have preserved its skin, but we can only speak of the Pongo, or the great orangutan, from the accounts travelers have given us of it. If these relations might be depended on, and if they were not often obscure, faulty, and exaggerated, we should not doubt of its being an animal of a different species from the Joko, more perfect, and approaching nearer to the human race. In his opening line, he takes for granted that this concept of the great orangutan, which we would now recognize as our gorillas from Africa and our orangutans of the East Indies, as instead a singular thing, and it is from this unfortunately flawed presupposition that he goes down 2 lines of questioning. First, is his great orangutan also actually one and the same with his Joko, which may have also included what we would recognize as juvenile orangutans? And 2, how nearly do these creatures, depending on the outcome of that first question, approach humans in identity? Buffon, after telling of the narratives of a few other authors, eventually comes around to 2 of those testimonies that I shared earlier, being the ones from Mr. Brozes and his interactions with Mr. Nonfoux, and it is in the context of these that he answers that first question. His concern here is really just about size. If these smaller apes that he's seen and these larger apes that he's heard about were hypothetically the same thing, what would account for that discrepancy? He gives 2 options. One, that they're overlapping varieties of the same species. The example he gives is that within any given area, you could have 2 distinct ethnic groups of humans who could look very different. despite still both being humans and living in that same exact area. And the second option that he gives is that this is more simply just a difference in age and maturity. He deliberates for a bit, but ultimately and a little anticlimactically, he resolves in his opinion that larger apes and smaller apes, with the evidence that he had at the time, should just be assumed as different species. Although this does unnecessarily split eastern orangutans into juvenile eastern orangutans and adult eastern orangutans, and also further confounds those adult eastern orangutans with what we would now recognize as gorillas. It does at least maybe split adult gorillas with the younger chimps. Although, even then, if he were shown an adult chimpanzee, he probably would have taken that out of his category of jocos and lumped that in with his idea of a great orangutan. With the presupposition he was working with, he probably chose the best option in making gorillas a clearly identified concept, but it's still not exactly what I'm hoping for. I'd estimate that a regional variant of something known elsewhere would be read as more distinct than some fully realized version of something that is already known to exist amongst the area of interest. Buffon's inaccuracy, though, would pretty quickly be mended, most notably by the work of Petrus Camper, who, being the premier anatomist of that century and having more access to skulls and bones than Buffon did, would pretty clearly separate eastern and western apes, and by the 1800s that would be the consensus. Talking a bit more about Buffon, he doesn't actually give too much description by his own words. I mean, he literally can't really. He never met what he would have considered as a great orangutan, and mostly just lets the quotations talk for themselves. A lot of which were some of our gorilla accounts from earlier, but other stuff about what I would consider chimpanzees, but especially a lot about eastern orangutans. But I feel it's important to say here that if one were to read all of these in their entirety, they would, in some way, walk away with the expectations of dangerous humanoid biped, dark-furred, immensely large and strong, mysterious apes tucked away in the interior of Africa. Even if it's not separated from other things that accurately, that is still great for us. And overall, I must commend Buffon for all of his academic work and rigor in providing as many sources as he did for the time period, and his attempts to guide the audience to accurately read what these are. If you were to read a single source throughout this entire time period through the lens of the contemporary readers, and like most of them not having access to his citations in their original print, or in my case having like 70 other tabs open up on my laptop, he, in my opinion, gets the closest to provoking the imagination of something that I would recognize as a gorilla, so he very much has my appreciation. And I suppose something key should be stressed here. When it comes to these key commentators, quotations or descriptions are what matter, not citations. If an author is discussing apes and he says, "You can learn more here by reading this on such and such page," that isn't going to help. The average reader does not have his trusty copy of Haeclotus Posthumus that he's just been itching to dust off or whatever. In order for the audience to imagine and thus anticipate anything, it has to be directly told to them by the text of the pages in the book they're currently reading, by either direct quotation or summary. Buffon, certainly, was not guilty of this. Regarding that second question, I'm going to elect to put that away for just a moment longer, and move on to Pennant's analysis. He is, to my relief at this point, much less expansive and complicated. Buffon, depending on the edition and translations, yaps, justifiably, as this was a confusing and existentially meaningful topic to him, for anywhere from 20 to 40 pages. Thomas Pennant, on the other hand, says everything in about 2. I wonder which of these two you think I identify more with. But anyway, Pennant doesn't even really bother bringing up the suggestion of distinctions. He kinda just throws everything he finds under the single class of great ape, which, fun fact, as far as I can tell, is the first utilization of that term as a species label. Buffon, if I remember correctly, used similar terminology, but rather for descriptive purposes, not as the label or classification that we kinda think of when we hear that term. So I think I'm gonna credit Pennant for that one. Regarding that concept, though, it is interesting to see where he draws more from Eastern apes and where he draws more from Western apes in his attempts to construct his idea of the great ape. Regarding range, in the spirit of his theory on great ape, he describes them within historic orangutan, chimpanzee, and gorilla habitats. But when it comes to other qualities, he often tends to overemphasize reporting from either eastern or western apes. Take, for example, their hair. He seems to assume the traits of our orangutan as the default, describing his great ape with reddish shaggy hair, which appears in similar spots and of the same length as what we would recognize as typical of our orangutans. He does make a later clarification that they could vary in size and color, some being covered in black, but it's treated very much as just a passing mention of his. As for other stuff, like their frame, behavior, and temperament, he draws mostly from African sources, although still not entirely. Regarding his great ape, they, to quote Pennant, are solitary and live in the most desert places, grow to the height of 6 feet, has prodigious strength, will overpower the strongest man, the old ones are shot with arrows, only the young can be taken alive, live entirely on fruits and nuts, will attack and kill the locals who wander in the woods, will drive away the elephants, and beat them with their fists, or pieces of wood, will throw stones at people that offend them, sleep in trees, make a sort of shelter from the inclemency of the weather, are of a solitary nature, grave appearance and melancholy disposition, and even when young, not inclined to frolic, are vastly swift and agile, go erect, sometimes carrying away the young locals. And of course, there is also a reference to their similarity to man. Again, Pennant describes his great apes like this: with a flat face, and a deformed resemblance of the human, ears exactly like those of a man. Once again, I will hold off on the significance of this for now. Overall, Pennant's account isn't too in-depth. I would say it gives the reader the conception of a tall, large, strong, possibly dark-haired, intelligent man-like ape, existing in certain parts of the world, including Africa, and I will grant that if one were to ruminate on that idea for long enough, perhaps they would have imagined in their head what I may recognize as a gorilla. How properly a reader could have placed that in the world accurately, however, is unfortunately, in my opinion, quite hindered. Things were pretty simple regarding him, so let's move on now. Diverting from my original order and now discussing Linnaeus's work, things are once again more complicated, as if you'll recall from my passing mention earlier, his publication was a continually updating one, and thus there isn't a single thing that we can point to, and have expected his audience for the most part to have adopted that as their opinion. This'll make him a bit more tedious to go through, but it's well worth it for the insights he gives us. And throughout all of this, we'll be observing how he, and also his successor Gmelin, used the terms Homo troglodytes, which I believe is where we get the term cavemen from, and another term, Simia satirus, which would follow in the already established tradition of linking the newly discovered simians by Europeans with the satyrs of old, which was another theme that was present in some of Pliny's works. Homo troglodytes would be used between 1758 and 1772. Meanwhile, Simia satirus was used from the first edition back in 1735, and would continue on until the end of our period of interest. Linnaeus's Satyrus, for the first 2 decades, doesn't include any indication of any gorilla influence. It is introduced as a minimally described tailed primate, and it isn't until 1748 that it is redefined as a tailless ape, with pretty much no other content. This all changes, though, in what is usually considered his most popular 10th edition in 1758, where the concept is greatly expanded upon, and as I said earlier, the term Homo troglodytes is introduced alongside it. His Satyrus at this point I think just reads as a tailless, proportionally man-like animal, with a facial likeness also similar to a person, covered in black hair, and inhabiting unspecified parts of Africa and Asia. Anybody already familiar with what we now know to be chimpanzees, and also those that would come to know of them as their understanding increased over the following decades, would probably just assume these creatures as a chimp. His troglodytes is a bit more elaborated on. Like his Satyrus, it is located in both Africa and Asia, although from his specific wording, I personally read a slightly Eastern bias, I guess. But they are still a haired, tailless ape, and in this case the human anatomy is even more stressed, but smaller than the average person. Behaviorally, they are described as walking both quadrupedally and bipedally, being nocturnal, solitary in nature, Speaking little, what he meant by that isn't that clear, and even an understanding of their own mortality and a possible afterlife. Okay, that's all a little weird, and I'll break down my thoughts of it in a moment, but first let's look ahead to his future editions, most notably his 1766 edition, starting again with his Satyrus. Despite now officially referencing the word chimpanzee in his sources, basically his entire description becomes what we would now recognize as orangutans. Now this Satyrus is told as only living in the East, having reddish hair, and although the descriptions regarding anatomy aren't that accurate, and in fairness, who can blame him? It seems pretty clear what he's trying to talk about, in my opinion. His Homo troglodytes, on the other hand, essentially stays the same in how it's described. These definitions would become truncated in his 1772 edition, and stagnate there well beyond his death in 1778. So what we're dealing with here are his two categories of men that are more like beasts, which is implied through his application of the term homo, and his beasts that are very much like men, which can be seen in his continuation of the term simia. The former he indicates as having black fur in populations in Africa and Asia, and although not completely accurate, can be pretty easily read as our chimps. Meanwhile, the latter he indicates as having reddish fur and populations in the East alone, which can be pretty easily read as our orangutans. Thematically, this will become very relevant as we discuss aspects of Monboddo's work. The question on your mind, though, is probably this. What does any of that have to do with gorillas? The disappointing but ultimately necessary answer is that unfortunately the most important naturalist from our time period of interest never really seemed to have concocted anything in his mind that could be recognized as a gorilla. He did reference a black-haired, beast-like man in Africa, but there were key statements about it that could only make the reader recognize or imagine something like our chimpanzee, whether they were already aware of it or not. Posthumous editions, however, would remedy this. Between the late 1780s and early 1790s, this would become the view put forward by his successors. Homo troglodytes is now Simia troglodytes, and by that point is pretty inarguably our chimpanzee. Simia satyrus, on the other hand, gets divided into three subspecies, and one of them, Gmellin's Simia satyrus Pongo, is the closest anybody got in the Linnaean tradition pre-1800 in articulating something like gorillas. To quote a 1792 English translation of Systema Naturae, this Simia satyrus Pongo inhabits the island of Java and the interior parts of Guinea, has no pouches within his cheeks, no tail, and no callosities on the buttocks, which last are plump and fleshy. All the teeth are similar to those of men, the face is flat, naked, and tawny. The ears, hands, feet, breast, and belly are likewise naked, and the hair of the head descends on both temples in the form of tresses. The hair on the back and loins is in small quantities. It is 5 or 6 feet high, and walks always erect on the 2 hind feet. It has not been ascertained whether the females of this species or variety are subject to periodical discharges, but analogy renders this almost unquestionable. This animal is, by Dr. Gmelin, considered only a variety of the orangutan. The important picture here is that this is a dark-furred, distinctly tall, tailless ape, residing in Africa, but also the island of Java. So you know what? I'm mostly satisfied with that. As for how well they attempt to distinguish what I would recognize as gorillas from other known things, they do a very good job at separating it from chimpanzees, which is the most important boundary in my opinion. However, it is still pretty broadly lumped in with orangutans, and also jocos, which at that point kind of just referred to smaller, what we would now recognize as juvenile apes. Gmelin even makes the proposition that all apes genuinely could just be one distinct thing, and that, like dogs, there could be different breeds that themselves could spawn endless varieties, which for the readers, even if they were to imagine something like a gorilla, this comment then makes that a very imprecise thing. Overall, Linnaeus and his successor Gmelin, honestly Gmelin's kind of the MVP here, give us probably the best information to hypothesize when gorillas as a concept may have truly began being imagined by interested audiences, but rather disappointingly he gives us the most pessimistic estimate that it may not have been until the end of our time period of interest that we can truly start seeing gorillas being understood.
That was admittedly a bit of a downer to end off on, but I believe our next guy can work to brighten up those somewhat drab estimates, at least a little. So, reintroducing James Burnett, or Lord Monboddo, whichever you want to call him, he is certainly the black sheep of these four. He wasn't a naturalist, he was a little odd in general, just read his Wikipedia page. His work itself is very much just a commentary on a lot of Buffon's material, and he explores this topic from an explicitly controversial lens compared to the other three. It honestly would have been a little fair to just not include him as a key source, but he had a few interesting narratives unique to himself, and he's a useful segue to talk about some later stuff. So, for my own practical interests, I'm gonna keep him. Regarding how he develops the image of a gorilla, as in its description and distinction, I'm gonna mostly just summarize what he said really quick, as that isn't really what I'm that interested in talking about regarding him. When reading Monboddo, one would pretty clearly be shown the prompts needed to imagine a gorilla. It's the usual stuff of large, tall, strong, black-haired, tailless, man-like apes, with a distinct focus on its intelligence relative to our other three authors, and it's communicated through a lot of the stories and summaries he gives. And as I said a moment ago, they mirror Buffon a lot. As for how accurately he distinguishes that image of a gorilla from things that we know to be, in reality, different from it, he's hard to gauge. His major focus for our purposes is his idea of the orangutan, a good portion of which is comprised of gorilla imagery, and from his viewpoint that should be read very literally as man of the woods. His idea of that he seems to have considered at that point to be residing in both Africa and Asia, where we would recognize our gorillas, our chimps, and our orangutans as living nowadays, and perhaps a little bit beyond that too. He separates that from monkeys, baboons, and even other tailless apes, but it's really unclear in my opinion where exactly those boundaries are and why. My best guess might be that once again he pretty closely mirrors Buffon, but really, in my opinion, none of that even matters much. He wouldn't have been seen as much of an authority figure on this subject. As I said, we are interested in him for other purposes, primarily his willingness to discuss a certain touchy subject. To quote the man himself, "This opinion, I know, will appear very singular to many, and will give offense to some, as highly derogatory, according to their notions, from the dignity of human nature. But as I do not write to flatter the vanity or prejudices of any man, I will fairly examine the question, and begin with stating the facts." First off, our boy would have done numbers as an early 21st century political commentator. Second, what is this question he refers to? And third, what is his potentially troublesome opinion? Regarding this question, I'll need to preamble a little. A lot of this discussion so far has been about how do the fragmented narratives that we see to have some origin in gorillas get imagined by commentators, and furthermore interpreted in the light of other known things, namely other great apes. How do they remain distinct? How much do they get absorbed? Which, as I've stated before, is essential in determining how willing I am to call something a cryptid, or former cryptid, more accurately. That definitional factor, of course, is only half of the equation. The other element, as stated earlier, is relevance, and Monboddo gives us the most clear and unapologetic example of why this may have been more interesting of a topic to people than we would initially expect. So, finally coming back to Monboddo's question, we see indications in the writing of Buffon and Linnaeus that they were asking this, and I'd argue that at least subconsciously we see this recognized in nearly every great ape narrative of the time, or really all times rather, and it is this. How do these narratives of so-called men of the woods get interpreted at the most existential level? How do they relate to us? A controversial question in and of itself. His answer, though, is about the most controversial option. For the moment, though, I'll let him speak for himself. The substance of all these different relations is that the orangutan is an animal of the human form, inside as well as outside, that he has the human intelligence as much as can be expected in an animal living without civility or arts, that he has a disposition of the mind, mild, docile, and humane, that he has the sentiments and affections peculiar to our species, such as a sense of modesty, of honor, and of justice, and likewise an attachment of love and friendship to one individual, so strong that in some instances that the one friend will not survive the other, that they live in society and have some arts of life,
for they build huts and use an artificial weapon for attack and defense, viz. A stick, which no animal, merely a brute, is known to do. They show also counsel and design by carrying off creatures of our species for certain purposes and keeping them for years together without doing them any harm, which no brute creature was ever known to do. They appear likewise to have some kind of civility among them, and to practice certain rites, such as that of burying the dead. It is from these facts that we are to judge whether or not the orangutan belongs to our species. To make his point, he pits Buffon and Rousseau against each other, which, yes, Rousseau is involved in this, but for the sake of working with material that you're already familiar with, it's simpler just to think of this in terms of Buffon versus Linnaeus. Buffon, who is alike with Monboddo in that they are both usually regarded as proto-evolutionists, departs from him on this matter by pretty definitively separating humans and any hairy man-like apes in his works. Linnaeus differs from that in having one of his kinds of apes, his Homo troglodytes from earlier, transcend other species and into our genus of man, being alongside us Homo sapiens. This was so controversial that it's probably the reason that after his death the name got changed to Simia troglodytes. Nevertheless, this already radical decision of even organizing humans within his taxonomic structure, and two, his decision to put what was generally considered just another animal so close to humans, was not enough for Monboddo, as he seemed to disagree with even the separation of Homo sapiens and Homo troglodytes, as his answer to our question from earlier is that us humans, compared to some of our newly discovered men of the woods, are essentially just more developed versions of them. They technically aren't us, but their nature is necessary to our nature. One of his more succinct statements on that boundary is this: but though I hold the orangutan to be of our species, I must not be supposed that I think the monkey or ape, with or without a tail, participates of our nature. On the contrary, I maintain that, however much his form may resemble ours, yet he is, as Linnaeus says of the troglodyte, nec nostri generis, nec sanguinis, not of our kind, nor of our blood. Essentially, I just believe he's saying that his idea of the orangutan should probably be read more as like us than like any of the other animals that we would typically associate it with. I'm speculating a bit more right here, but if I had to give an analogy for his opinion, I guess I would lean on like the square-rectangle dichotomy, in the same way that all squares are rectangles, where they both have shared essential properties, but the former has additional ones that separate it further. What he would recognize as people and men of the woods both participate in some similar nature, but the former once again has additional traits that distinguish it from the latter. He's a little confusing and he rambles a lot, but that's the best I've been able to understand him. And I suppose I'll also refrain from explaining why Monboddo, and I guess also Buffon and Linnaeus, came to the conclusions that they did. First off, I'm still not totally sure about some stuff, but if I even am reading it correctly, which I hope I am, I imagine you'd still get bored by me talking about their methodology, information, and presuppositions, which is probably indicative that you are indeed a normal person. But okay, now let's draw out some of the deeper implications of that. First, just think about the possible viewpoints that we can gather from these three in their context. First, although I haven't made much mention of it, I'm assuming you're already familiar with this view. It's the one of the popular culture at the time, that humans are so distinct from everything else in nature that one should hesitate even to study people as if they were among them. Two, there is still a chasm between man and beast, even for the most anatomically similar ones, but nonetheless humans can still be seen as among the kingdom of animals. We see this among early Linnaeus, his successors, and Buffon. Three, there are some beasts so close to us we can actually consider them as in some way ordered alongside us. We see this in prime Linnaeus during the mid-1700s. And four, some of those things that we thought were just beasts, we are in fact deeply connected to them. Great apes, in the context of this video, are just inherently interesting to a unique degree because of how much they relate to us. And to whatever degree that you believe our gorillas were distinguished to the general public, that same rhetoric can be applied to them.
I want you to really try to imagine how much of an audience and knowledge of them could have accumulated, and how invested those paying attention would have been. And I'm not even sure how you'd go about measuring and comparing that interest to other things in any objective way. So the best I feel that I can do is probably this scuffed hypothetical estimation. First, think of some of the other popular animals of the time. Stuff like zebras, lions, rhinos, elephants, tigers, basically all the things that in modern culture are stereotyped as the star zoo animals. The factors that make all of those things so captivating, being exotic, dangerous, big, powerful, often intelligent, and striking in appearance, great apes, although coming into mass popularity later, and the gorillas that may have been imagined as a part of that concept, have all of those qualities and more, that more being, namely, their likeness to us, far surpassing even anything like monkeys. There is the surface level reaction to this that's just like, whoa dude, this thing kinda looks and acts like me, that's so cool, which will still inevitably attract some, but it goes deeper, as the existential implications of seeing or even hearing about great apes penetrate as far as our relation to and place in the natural world. Thus, the future discovery and distinction of them could have massive conclusions that one may be motivated to pay attention to. I once again encourage you to really try and imagine how many people may have been drawn to this, and as we move into our next 50 or so years of interest, even more in that time period, I implore you to ponder the eagerness that one might have regarding these creatures, that they could have in help determining your place in the world and how you relate to it, or rather consider the anxiety or even the dread that same interest could also invoke, that these creatures could potentially challenge the place in reality that you took for granted, something that previously you never thought you would be questioning, that the more you learn about them, the more you may be tempted to just throw away your deeply rooted beliefs about the world, or that even if you do wrestle and maintain them, you'll be always worried that you'll have that voice in the back of your mind, whispering that in your ear these are just after-the-fact rationalizations, and that you should just give up on trying to defend this. Could there have been a more weighty thing to investigate at that time? Really just try to sit with that for a moment. Imagine how our 3 or so potential audiences, ones that probably would have overlapped, ones that just saw these as cool creatures, ones that just recognized them as very unique animals but stopped at that, and those that contemplated them with existential questions, and try to imagine how numerous and invested all of those people were, all estimated as much bigger after the start of the 19th century. That's when apes really began to be commonly procured and studied, but I'll hypothesize that it probably wasn't until the last quarter of the 18th century that this audience really began to form. Before that, any kind of ape was so rare in Europe, the stories were often gathered just through random travelogues, and serious scientific treatments of them, especially ones that at least in some way addressed those existential issues, not just their physical resemblance to us, weren't altogether present until the later 1700s, and even then it was pretty quiet and underdeveloped in my opinion. So, in conclusion for this whole section, although we do have plenty of pretty authentic and, from a modern perspective, hard to dispute narratives about gorillas, these should be seen as just in the broader concept of the idea of a great ape, and even by the end of our time period, had not been accurately distinguished, although the intuition that there was indeed a difference, and that there was some sort of intelligent, big, strong, tall, black-haired, tailless ape in Africa was present, and I would also estimate that the larger audience which would anticipate this creature, what we now call gorillas, began forming near the very tail end of this time period, due to the inherently captivating nature of an animal like that, due to the resemblance to humanity that it may have had, and the challenging existential questions that it necessarily asks. Regarding the end point of this time period, there were quality descriptions, unideal distinctions, a generally niche popularity, and a high-ish engagement that began from essentially nothing around the year 1600 to still not that much around the year 1700, which is where scholarly acknowledgement would begin. And from that point it blossomed into my conclusion here by the year 1800, and I'm pretty happy to see that development. So having said all of that, how willing am I to pronounce that gorillas were indeed cryptids throughout this time period across Western Europe? And I think my response to that would have to be a very hesitant,
Kind of. And it, of course, varies depending on which given year you're specifically looking at, because a lot of the narratives that we relied upon until the gorillas' discovery came about in the 17th century, but I think a lot of them remained in the realm of stories or tales until treated with seriousness, and also just popularized in Edward Tyson's 1699 publication, where the practice of applying academic rigor to apes, and any idea of gorillas as a consequence, because of their unique likeness to us, is kindled. Before that, all we can do is speculate or hypothesize about the hearsay or small talk that may have been going on among seafarers, which is really only evidenced, if that word is even applicable here, by observations I made in certain accounts that they only heard such and such thing, or the appropriation of certain terms, especially Pongo and Orangutan. But with this, we can begin to observe what an actual audience who's trying to put everything together thinks, even if they only ever got so far. Were gorillas indeed cryptids across this time period? If I had to choose yes or no, I would pick yes. Even in the 1600s, I think there are enough clues to say that our creature had a cryptid-like status, even if it's only among a very specific subculture and lifestyle like seafarers or merchants, which I imagine quietly persisted and perhaps even developed in its conceptualization until Savage and Wyman's discovery in 1847. Around 1700 is when I think you can say this idea, what we would recognize nowadays as a gorilla, began to actually be studied. In my opinion, qualifying as a gorilla among another specific and small crowd, but still pretty minimally. That sentiment remains pretty consistent up until a bit past the halfway point of that century, where my confidence level in the video's claim gradually increases as the decades go on, to the point that at the century's closing, I'd give it a pretty assertive yes. So once again, were gorillas cryptids during 17th and 18th century Western Europe? Yes, but it's the kind of yes that deserves a lot of qualifying statements and asterisks, to a point where, in the future, if my standards change as this series hopefully goes on, I could reasonably see myself rejecting that claim in at least some regard. And thank you for making it to the end of this section of the video. When I recorded this originally, I didn't think I would have to break it up into 2 parts, but due to the storage stress it's putting on my laptop, it's kind of a necessity at this point, and this felt like the most natural place to break that off. I'm not going to talk too much here. All of the postscript ramblings I'd really feel like doing should be in the second half. Just due to the small size of my channel, it usually takes a few days for my videos to get into the algorithm, so hopefully by the time anyone sees it, maybe my next one will be out. If not, hopefully it'll just be a few days after that. And sources and whatnot will have to come a few days further beyond there. I know I said I didn't want to ramble too much, but still. Thank you for watching even half of what I made. Thank you even for clicking on it. Really, I appreciate it. I hope you do watch the second half, God willing that I can actually get that out at some point. But even just regarding this section, I really hope that I was able to make your time and attention worth it. I hope that you're just a little bit more fascinated with the world. God bless, and goodbye.